Today, we're going to be talking about hell and whether or not hell is actually a place of eternal torment. Let's get started. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We hope that you are enjoying the content. We want you to please do us a favor. We need you to please like, share, comment, and subscribe. As you all know, we are participating in an experiment to see if we can grow this channel to 1 million subscribers in just 1 year. We want to demonstrate to YouTube that Christian content creators are here to stay, and we are not ashamed to actually share our faith and advocate study of God's word and just say all we need to say about the importance of following Jesus Christ. So please participate and help us as we're trying to grow this channel to 1 million subscribers and form a community of believers who will represent Jesus Christ. So today we're going to be talking about hell. We're going to be talking about whether or not every time you see the word hell in the Bible, it actually means a place of eternal torment. What we're going to see today is that there are three important words that are used to translate the English term hell into our modern Bibles. And what we're going to learn is every time we see the word hell, it does not always mean a place of eternal torment. Now, in order for us to understand this topic correctly, what we are going to do is we're going to study the Old Testament's use of the word hell, and then we're going to understand the New Testament's use of the word hell. And we're going to see how things evolved and changed from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Now, in the Old Testament, the word that was used to express the idea of hell, as we may call it in the English language, was the Hebrew term Sheol. And the understanding and the meaning of this word is quite simple. It simply means the place of the dead. When a person referred to Sheol or hell, they were simply referring to the underworld, the place that is void, the place that has no activity. In Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 10, it gives the perfect definition or the idea behind what was meant by the term Sheol. It reads, "Whatever your hands find to do, do with all your strength, because there is no work, planning, knowledge, or wisdom in Sheol where you are going." It was understood that everyone is going to go to Sheol. And whatever is not done once a person has landed in Sheol, it will not be done. And the reason that is the case is because the idea behind death in the Old Testament was that when a person dies, they cease to be effective, relevant, or useful. They enter into the place of the dead, that is Sheol, the underworld, the spirits of the dead, and they dwell there to accomplish nothing. So if you read through the Psalms and if you read through the Proverbs and Isaiah and all the other Old Testament passages, you see people being encouraged to do what they need to do while they're alive, because when you're dead, then that's just the end of it. That's all. Now, the question we must answer is, how does this very simplistic view of hell evolves into what we understand to be a place of torment? Well, one of the things that contributed to this evolution of understanding is the Hellenization of the Hebrew people and the use of the Greek language to describe or even to expound upon Old Testament and Hebrew traditions and understandings. So when we talk about hell in the New Testament, we see hell represented by two words. The first word is the word Hades. Hades carried some of the similar meanings and understandings of the Old Testament use of the word Sheol. When people thought about Hades, they generally thought about it being a place where the dead exist. In fact, it was commonly known as the realm of the dead. It was the netherworld. It was the place where people, in general, all people went as they departed this life to dwell there forever. Now, it's interesting because as the exile came along, the idea of Hades began to change. Rather than being just simply a place where everyone goes whenever they die, it became known as a place where the believers went to anticipate or wait for resurrection. The idea that Israel had been dead because of their disobedience, an idea that there would be some national resurrection, lent this idea to the use of the word Hades to describe what it is people would be resurrected from. So rather than thinking about everyone who lands in Hades. Now the conversation through the exilic period is that we are going to wait on the resurrection through the Messiah in Hades. So now you see this type of hope associated with the term Hades, and really a claim on a space for individuals who would be anticipating the coming of the Messiah and the manifestation of the resurrection. But then there's a third use, or a third idea of the idea of Hades. It is no longer by Jesus's time seen as a place where only the believers or only the hopeful go. By this time, it is seen as a place where all people go, and there are sort of different experiences in this place called Hades. We see this in Luke chapter 16, verse 23 and verse 26. Hades by this time is not necessarily a place of torment. A person may experience torment there, but it's not the place one goes to be tormented. And we see this in Luke chapter 16, verse 23. It says, "And being in torment in Hades," it says here in verse 23, "he looked up and saw Abraham a long way off with Lazarus at his side." Now, the rich man has somehow landed in hell, and what he has done is he has seen in Hades, okay, he has seen Abraham. Now, if Hades is a place of torment, Abraham would not be there. But Hades is obviously a place where all people go, and there is what we find in verse 26, a chasm between the experiences or the people who are righteous and those who are not. For those who are unrighteous, they are in this general place, okay, of departed souls experiencing torment, while those who died in faith are in the same space experiencing joy, if you will, because of the hope that they have in the coming of the Messiah and the resurrection of the righteous. So you see in this text how it kind of evolved and went from one thing to another, then it went back to its original state. But yet there are these interesting details to the idea of hell that we don't see at all in the Hebrew text, and we definitely don't see in the earlier stages of the use of the word Hades. But now we're seeing this colorful and this very bright expression of what hell is like, and now it prepares the stage for the ultimate use of the word hell, which is Gehenna. Now, Gehenna is a place of torment, and it's an interesting word because it gets its name from an Old Testament passage that was used to pronounce judgment over those committing idolatry. And in order to understand this term, you really have to go back to the Old Testament and study everything that is uniquely tied to this idea of Gehenna. Now, in order to do that, you would go to places like 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 3, and then you would go to 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 6. And it talks about the abominations, the idolatrous acts of Ahaz and Manasseh, who would literally take their children and they would offer them as sacrifices to the god Moloch. And they would do this, and the prophets would speak out against them, namely Jeremiah in chapter 7 and chapter 19. Isaiah also would speak out against these acts of idolatry, and they would proclaim judgment through, or should we say, in the valley of Hinnom. Now, this is important because this is the place where the offerings were being made, but the prophets, in their apocalyptic terms, began to equate this valley of Hinnom, where idolatry was being taken place, to the place where God would send his eschatological fire to burn up the actions and the people who were committed to these idolatrous acts. So if you can imagine it this way, the place that was once used to commit idolatry will be the place that God will use to render his just judgment on those who are committing such acts. And so we really see this kind of definition take place during the 2nd century BC. That is the exilic period, where people are beginning to write in more apocalyptic terms, and they're using old symbols and providing new meanings to it based on their own lived experiences. What we find is when Jesus comes, he doesn't denounce those meanings or those ideas, but rather he embraces the literature that we may not consider to be canonical, but Jesus simply thought and really considered it to be historically relevant, so that when Jesus comes, he's using terms like Gehenna, a term that is uniquely developed through the early traditions of Israel during the what we call the 400 years of silence. So it's very important that, especially when reading Jesus, to recognize that Jesus had this idea of hell that was foreign to the ancient ideas of hell, and it embodied the meaning of torment. Now, the use of the word Gehenna is exclusively attributed to Jesus Christ, except for one use of the term in James chapter 3, verse 6, where it talks about the fire of hell, the fire of Gehenna. And what James is pulling into consideration is the fact that hell, that is Gehenna, is a place where the prophet said God's judgment would fall upon a certain people for their idolatrous acts. And so in order to invoke that meaning, rather than using Sheol or Hades, they use the word Gehenna, because they want the people to understand that this is the coming of God's wrath that we're speaking of. We're talking about the fact that as Jeremiah predicted that God would use that valley in the Old Testament to destroy the people who are making offerings and giving their children to the false gods. What he wants the people in his day to see is that that same judgment that fell on ancient Israel is now being prepared for the modern Israelites who have not learned from the lessons of their forefathers. Now, the interesting thing about the use of this word Gehenna is the implications that it carries. Anytime you see the word Gehenna, at least the concept that built the Greek word Gehenna as it is used in the New Testament, there is some sort of exilic, if you will, chastisement going on. You think about Jeremiah, who is prophesying to Israel as they are entering into Babylonian exile. You think about the words of Isaiah, who saw the days of the exile coming and tried to warn Israel of her rebellion. You see all these different examples, and there's something unique about the use of the word Gehenna. Attached to it is the expectation that God will use, in many instances, pagan nations to carry out his judgment that will eventually lead to the destruction of a particular people and a particular area. When we see Jesus use the word Gehenna, we ought to think about the fact that, yes, he is referring to torment and he's referring to punishment that individuals will experience because of their disobedience. But the truth that we can find in the use of this word is the way it is a word that has been developed over time, that has an old covenant or Old Testament heritage that should be invited into the conversation when we're thinking about Jesus' use of hell. So for instance, in Matthew 23:15, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell, the child of torment. Think about what that would have meant to the hearers of this declaration. The fact that they are being invited into the world of Jeremiah, the world that Jesus is building, built on the prophets who talked about a time where literally Jerusalem would be set on fire. All right. You see the parallels to what this would have meant in the Old Covenant versus what it means in the New Testament. And ironically, this very real experience of Gehenna here on earth is what Jesus builds out to be the eternal consequence for those who will not believe and follow in faith. This is where we get passages such as Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. Fear not them which kill the body, but are able not to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. So you see that we have somewhat of a very mixed but a very vibrant understanding of the word Gehenna as it was being used by Jesus Christ to refer to, yes, the troubles that one will experience here on earth, but also the troubles that one will experience in eternity. So if we had to answer the question whether or not hell is real, we would answer unequivocally, yes, hell is real. If we had to answer the question whether hell, every time we see it in the Bible, means torment, then we would have to say, no, it doesn't. Because sometimes the word simply means a holding place. Sometimes it means a place of eternal torment. Sometimes it even means a place of temporary or earthly torment, as we see in the case of the prophets and the exile of the Babylonians, and essentially the exile of the Romans as well. So as we think about these concepts, it will do us a great service to take the time to do a couple of word studies to see how these words are being used in the passage that we're considering. And that way we'll be able to have a better view or perspective of the ideal of hell and how we can avoid it. All right. So thank you so much for listening. We hope there's been something said to encourage you and maybe guide you to further studies. But we're going to continue to study different topics, and we're going to prepare for tomorrow. And we hope that you'll join us for another study in God's word. Until next time, thank you for watching, and God bless.